Hello, and welcome to Varn Solo. Well, I've often been trying to get positive, encouraging messages lately to a lot of you doing organizing work. I'm here to discuss a general trend. I'm going to use the first example that I titled this piece with of ultra left as an example of terms that are basically slurs that people in certain groups, socialists, use as a means of differentiation from other groups in entirely emotive fashion, unless you were being very, very specific. And they've been reclaimed by certain groups too. So we can talk about this. All right. Ultra leftism comes up in a couple of different essays and at different times. Broadly speaking, ultra left originally referred to left communism as a variant of traditional Marxism that rejected either electoral work, such as the Italian left communist, or rejected party formation, such as the Council Communist. And it was pretty much limited to that. In the French tradition, the ultra gauche, which I know I mispronounced, but the ultra left actually was adopted as a positive statement for successor organizations and groupings developed from theorists such as Bordiga, Otto Ruhl, Anton Pannekoek, Hermann Gorta, Paul Maddock, Jan Appel. And then in the late 70s through the aughts, Bajak Kamat, Gilles Duvet, and the communization theorist, and can be found in both left communism and communization, who pull from the same theorists but are not the same. Now, Lenin included these two standpoints as the Dutch-German tradition and the Italian tradition, which is represented by Bordiga and later on Dement. They were inspirational on the French ultra left, which was Marxist. These were, from Lenin forward, traditionally considered to be the ultra left. But it got redefined pretty thoroughly in the 1950s and 60s as a slur. Furthermore, most of the original ultra-left groupings were devastated in the aftermath of World War II and in the establishment of various forms of communism in Europe. There are other ultra-lefts that you could talk about: the Shanghai Commune, the first and second one. You can talk about Mao's denunciation of Lin Bao. You can talk about various ultra-Maoist groups in Latin America. Often this is said about Shining Path and other groups. But the thing is, they don't have anything to do with the historical meaning of ultra-leftism. The expansion of the term came as a slur in regards to the new left. First of all, some ultra-left ideas came about as reaction to 1968 and 1969 and Mao Spandex and a lot of discontent around students and the relatively moderate positions taken by the official communist parties after the mid-1950s and 1960s and in light of the Sino-Soviet split. And so some things that are considered ultra-left adjacent are developments of the ultra-left, such as the Situationist International, Apparismo and Autonomia in Italy, Big Flame, various forms of libertarian socialists within the Marxist tradition also were expanded to be considered ultra-left. But again, you lose what Lenin was talking about. Now, I'm not here to say that we should limit our uses of ultra-left to just mean what Lenin meant by it, because I understand that language develops. You cannot freeze a concept or a term. All right. There's kind of two essays that really expanded the meaning of ultraleftism. Betty Reed's 1969 pamphlet, Ultraleftism in Britain, which talked about groups left of the Communist Party of Great Britain as ultra-left. This included the various Trotskyist groups and anarchist and syndicalist groups, or people who supported the line of the Communist Party during the Sino-Soviet split. So all Maoist groups, according to this Marxist-Leninist Betty Reed, was considered an ultra-leftist. Peter Cormejo in 1970 also wrote an essay that's very influential in the Democratic Socialists of America, and one that I kind of hate, actually, even though I used to work for a magazine named after Peter Cormejo's movement. The reason why I hate it is it made ultra-leftism really vague, because it meant a movement against the means or interest of the general workers. The thing is, no one can agree on what the means and interests of the general workers are. They're not taken by polls. If you try to poll it, you're usually doing things that define workers differently than Marxists do. It's a mess. So basically, everyone can call everyone else ultra-lefts. So between Betty Reed's expansion in 1969 in the Marxist-Leninist context, including against other Marxist-Leninists, and Peter Cormejo's expansion in his attempt to actually bring Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists back together in an American new communist movement that was less radical than the other new communist movement, you see an expanding of the category to mean anything that could be vaguely anti-electoral or just against what you want your group to do, or what union leadership wants to do, or what an alliance with the Labour Party in Britain or the Democratic Party in the United States wants to do. Which means that over time, it's effectively emotive, because everyone calls everyone ultra-left. And I can just think of, since I started watching X and Twitter, how many groups I've seen called ultra-left that have no historical relationship to any of the movements that I've seen today. I've seen modern monetary theorists called ultra-leftists. I have seen neo-Kautsky's called ultra-leftist. I have seen any Maoist who is not a Dengist called an ultra-leftist. I have seen MLs who embrace third periodism called ultra-leftists. I have seen the anti-war movement called ultra-leftists. And if we think about this, we can also see this in the Socialist Workers' Party. All right. Now, this is used by a lot of friends of mine. And it is a way to get followings by taking positions that are anti-electoral. But the thing is, some anti-electoral principles are principled if you think electoral work should be limited in certain situations. Getting behind any fucking Democrat who calls himself a progressive is not worth your time. So, by what they generally mean by ultra-leftism, it's just sectarianism. But the thing is, often the people accusing people of being sectarians are also being sectarians. We see this with liberals and their complaints about purity politics. Purity politics are litmus tests that you don't like. Ultra-left essentially serves the same function in a more Marxian sense with some historical baggage that most of you ignore. Similarly, but in another direction, tanky. Tanky is a pejorative. It is just a slur for people who opposed either the kind of crushing of what I consider a very mixed social category of the Hungarian insurrections and revolutions, and then the crushing of the Prague Spring. Both of those were referred to as tankies. And no, it does not cut clearly with Marxist-Leninists versus anti-Marxist-Leninists, because there was Maoist groups who supported the Prague Spring. There were good Marxist-Leninists who left being Marxist-Leninists over what happened in Hungary. There were people who were all over the place about this. I mean, frankly, George Lukács, often considered an ultra-leftist in the past, was on the Soviet side on this and equivocated about it towards the end of his life quite a bit. The point that I am making is that outside of very specific context, calling someone a tanky is just saying you think they're too authoritarian, and calling someone an ultra leftist is basically saying you think they're annoying or sectarian. But they're both sectarian claims that belie that often the criterion is what either the individual or small grouping doesn't like. And if they aren't articulating what elements make it ultra left or what parts of the working class it is at a concurred were, it is basically an emotive slur. There's lots of these on the left. I use tailism a lot, but I have a very strict definition of what it means. It means tailing the social positions of the working class that would actually undercut broad solidarity, or tailing a political party that claims to represent cultural positions of the working class in ways that tie you to a movement that you don't control. Both of those have historical usage in the communist movement, but again, you could say I just use it as a slur. People often use this with opportunists, which is political shenanigans that they don't like. But, you know, they don't call people who do political shenanigans that they do like opportunists. And so all these things are context relative. I'm not saying you shouldn't use these words, but I'm saying in forums that involve people who do not share your agreement or do not know this historical baggage, these terms aren't particularly useful. You know, it's like, you know, I make jokes all the time that are like this. I call people Orleanists, which if you took literally, I'm literally saying that they are trying to own the social democrats by siding, or the liberals by siding with the more progressive end of the monarchy to get reforms. Or I sometimes would call people Lassallians, the people who make forays to reactionary executives to build state socialism at the expense of the workers' movement, and who also have very vulgar notions of what the state can do as a classless entity while empowering an entity that actually crushes them. All right. But again, if you don't know the context, those are weird, weird insults. And I don't use them in general public. I'm not going to go to a DSA meeting or visit some other group and throw those things around with everybody. Do not treat your politics like a subcultural milieu, and do not use these blur words as slurs when they have historical meanings. If you're going to invoke the historical meaning, like even some people like Gilles Duvet does, as a positive, as a kind of reclaiming of the ultra left as a moniker, then do so. But if you expand a category of a term too broadly, it loses its meaning. And you just have everyone calling everybody the same thing as kind of a slur. And on that, protect your peace. Take care.